the whole population question. There are fads in population. There's a lot of population hysteria now. The thing is, I'm at this point old enough to remember population hysteria in the opposite direction. When I was growing up in the late 30s and early 40s, there was lots of population hysteria, except it was the reverse of the present one. The idea then was too few babies being born. In France, for example, the birth rate has fallen considerably for the previous 20 years. They were talking about racial suicide or national suicide in part of the French population. And we know Frenchmen less than 50 years. You extrapolate these trends, you can come up with almost anything. And also, all these countries needed a lot of people, a lot of young, physically fit young men to go into the army and get shot. And the source of that cannon fodder would dry up. So that was a terrible thing, too. So there was a big intellectual and cultural push for a larger population. And as I say, the population hysteria then was in that direction. Right now, last few years, of course, the fashion is just the opposite. So anytime a baby gets born, there's practically almost a bonfire lit outside to protest. And we have a zero population growth groups, et cetera, et cetera. But we have, I think, a very similar kind of irrationality in part of both forces. One of the points is, in general, in an economic analysis of population, is that usually you get about the population that you need, in the sense that the quantity of population is usually about what's, in the long run, about what's needed, or about what's best for the capital structure and the degree of market, the division of labor, and all the rest of it. And so what's overpopulation in one area might be, or in the same area, might be underpopulation in very different circumstances, and vice versa. For example, we all know about the evil Sparta. Sparta was the first case of community population control. It was a rather rigorous case. It was a case, even our current big ZPG people might balk a wee bit at the Spartan method. First of all, you have to remember the Spartans had no Fifth Amendment and no Bill of Rights or any of that stuff. So they went all out. The Spartan situation, Sparta in ancient Greece, any new Spartan baby would immediately be put out in the woods at night for 24 hours by itself. If it died, that was too bad. It showed it was unfit for the rigors of Spartan life. And if it lived, then it was, accepted in the community and raised. This was a primitive method of population control. It was before our modern techniques. The reason why the Spartans did that is not because they were total monsters or because they were somehow anti-baby in some philosophic sense. The reason they did it was very simple. They were living in a static society. There was no free market, to say the least. I mean, it was a very totalitarian caste kind of system, militarist kind of system. And so there were no jobs available for increased people. It was very simple. It's only really the free market that constantly generates new jobs for new people. If you have a status society or a status economy where everybody, the son of a carpenter becomes a carpenter and the son of a butcher becomes a butcher and all that, what happens if the butcher has two sons? And then you're in real trouble. What the hell does he do? So either you put him out in the woods at night or you do something else. So the point is the population problem really exists when you have a caste kind of system. You have a non-free system, a pre-industrial society, or a post-industrial society which is so controlled and restricted they can't do much. And so the Spartans did it not because they were philosophically anti-baby, because they were driven to it by these economic considerations. On the other hand, Athens didn't have to do it because Athens was a flourishing market kind of economy and they were highly commercialized. They didn't suffer from any kind of overpopulation question. So again, what the optimum population is, it depends very much on what's going on in the whole system. For example, the North American continent, when Columbus discovered America, the North American continent, including Mexico and Canada and the United States, had approximately 1 million Indians total. It's very difficult to figure out. Say 1 million Indians is about it. And these 1 million Indians were not exactly living in an affluent state. If there had been 10% more Indians, they all might have starved. They were in a very limited kind of system. But the 1 million Indians are just about the right population, say, for the economic terms, for the whole land area of the North American continent. Now, of course, we have something like 400 million living in the same area where 1 million Indians have lived, all of whom are living at a much higher living standard. Even the poorest American and Canadian, much higher living standard than the average Indian, and without too much trouble. The reason being, of course, the difference, the increased capital investment, the productivity, the whole market economy which comes into the picture. So 400 million Indians back in 1490 would have been a holy mess, and an unholy mess, I should say, with everybody killing each other for the few pieces of food that were left. 400 million people now is in a fairly good shape. So again, the population is not a sort of an absolute from outside. It depends on the economics of it. It depends on what's going on with the capital investment, with the whole standard of living, the production system, and so forth. You can't really isolate one from the other. To give an example about population, right now, even not just talking about the Indians, countries with a very high population density. Probably the highest population density is, say, Holland, at least one of the highest. Holland has an enormous number of people per square mile, yet they, of course, have a very high standard of living. Japan has a very high population density, has a high standard of living, growing. Hong Kong has a huge population density, an enormous number of people, practically no resources at all, has a very high standard of living. On the other hand, there are many very poor areas in the world which have a very low population density. Many parts of South America have very few people in it. A few Indians living on practically nothing. Here you have a situation of very low population and a low standard of living. Many parts of Africa have very few people in it too. See, our image of the teeming masses in underdeveloped countries is really mostly in Asia. But when you get to Africa and South America, you have a very different kind of situation. Even in Asia, as I say, you have teeming masses in Hong Kong, all doing very well. Also, in China, which is authentically highly populous, at least most of the population is in the coastal areas. Inland, you have very few people. There's really no correlation between population density and living standards. Within the United States, the ZPG barracks have reached a historical culmination just at the point, by some kind of tragic irony or whatever, or non-tragic irony, just at the point where the population growth is decreasing, it's leveling off. In other words, in the last few years, we've had a big leveling off in the birth rate, and which will presumably continue, helped along by the ZPG people, but certainly a trend which started before ZPG and will continue on after, because for various reasons, economic and cultural, etc., birth rate is leveling off very rapidly, and we'll get to a ZPG point in a couple of years at this rate. Sort of typical and characteristic, the high point of ZPG hysteria comes to the point where the ZPG goals are being achieved anyway. Basic reasons for this, fairly simple. The first thing that happens when you industrialize, this is what happened in Western Europe, it's what's happened in the underdeveloped countries in the 20th century. The first thing that happens vis-a-vis population is we cut the death rate. Lots of people who would have died at the age of 6 now live because of modern medicine. So you have a big cut in the death rate. Now this big cut, if you have a same birth rate and a big cut in the death rate, what you're going to have is an increase in population, usually a dramatic increase in population. This is not because people are breeding faster particularly, it's because they're not dying off as fast. So in the 19th century England, you had a big increase in population the same way in many 20th century developed countries. And what has always happened up till now, let's put it that way, and which seems to be a bit fair to happen in the future, is as the economy develops, as the standard of living goes up, each family decides to cut their birth rate because they don't want to have 8 families. For one thing, if you have 8 kids in a farm situation, a rural farm situation, it's usually an economic asset because each kid at the age of, there's no child labor laws on the farms, each kid at the age of 5 or something can start milking the cow, whatever else. And so kids are usually a net economic asset to the farmer. But as you urbanize and as you industrialize, this isn't true. As I mentioned before about the keeping child labor out from child labor laws, even so, even without that, I presume that kids will very often be a net economic liability for the parent for a long time, if not forever. So kids in urban America now are really a consumption good rather than investment, rather than a factor of production. As the kid gets older and goes off on his own, he doesn't pile back much money to the parents' coffers anyway. So the kid, as far as the parent is concerned, is a net economic liability. It might be a great psychic asset, but economically, there's a liability. So, as a result of which, and it doesn't take a great genius to realize this, you have big cuts in the birth rate and few. In other words, as the economy develops and industrializes and urbanizes, the birth rate tends to fall quite dramatically. I could tell even this of course is journalistic, in my own family, my grandparents, great-grandparents had about 8 kids from both sides, and the grandparents had less than that, and the present generation has like 1 kid apiece, if that. So, or 2. So there's a big falling off in birth rates as the people's standard of living go up. I presume this will continue. So you have an initial cut in the death rate. This causes a big increase in population. Everybody gets hysterical about this because if you project the trend, you'll have 10 billion people living on each square foot and all that nonsense. But actually what happens is since people can control their lives, you ensue after a certain gap of a couple of generations with a falling off in the birth rate, and you wind up with a sort of a pleasant situation. Within the United States, by the way, it appears to everybody everything is too crowded, and books have been written. This guy Jacques Ellul, for example, who's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because Jacques Ellul is a French reactionary of the deepest dye, reactionary in the truest sense. He's a Calvinist nut. He wants to go back before the industrial era and go back to everybody weaving his own boots and all that sort of stuff. He hates technology with a purple passion. So he has made great cause with the New Left, which for very different reasons hate technology. And to think of Elwell as being some sort of new leftist, then they should only know. At any rate, Elwell talks about the good old days, the glorious old days, the Middle Ages, and everybody was mobile, and things weren't crowded, and people had a lot of room and a lot of breathing space. Of course, a lot of nonsense. In the Middle Ages, everybody lived in a little hut with 5 pigs and 8 kids and that sort of stuff, and never moved at all, never saw it beyond the boundaries of 5 miles. So, why do we think it was so crowded? Actually, if you look at the statistics, we find in the United States, I think the last census, 1970 census, showed that from 1960 to 1970, there was an absolute fall in population for, I think, 1/3 of the counties in the United States. Decline in population. That's just a leveling off of growth. You have a lot of ghost towns out there. In the Middle West and the Southwest, if any of you have seen the movie The Last Picture Show, you see this depressing picture of the total collapse, a gradual collapse of this town. People leave, people go to the big city, and so forth and so on. And an absolute decline in a lot of population. There's a lot of land out there with no people on it in the West. You might ask the question, who wants to go there? But that's a different question altogether. The point is, there's lots of land, lots of empty spaces. Even the inner cities have not really increased in population. New York City has remained the same total population for about 30, 40 years now. The same 7 million. And we haven't increased at all. The thing which has increased in the United States, the population has increased, is the suburbs. No question about that. But aside from the suburbs, there really has been no population growth worth speaking about. And the total itself is leveling off. The reason why we think it's more crowded is that people are too affluent. As people standard of living go up, they zip around a lot. They go to Europe, they go vacationing, and so forth and so on. They make themselves visible, which they weren't before. See, the medieval peasant there in his hut with his 8 pigs wasn't visible to anybody, except for whoever happened to wander in. Since there were no roads, in those days, that wasn't very likely. So you have a situation where things seem more crowded, but it's not because of population growth, it's really because people are better off, and they zip around a lot more. And they come into the big city, and they do all sorts of things which make things appear crowded. I don't know what solution there is to that, for this crowding thing. I mean, it boils down to either going off to the hills of Montana and becoming a hermit, which is one solution, or killing off all these people, which is not a very libertarian solution, also not very practical, or hoping they become impoverished and go back to where they stop traveling, which is also pretty impractical as well as being pretty evil. So at any rate, we boil down to it's not really population, but the strains and crowding of a more affluent society.